Every person thinks about where we will all eventually go, but no person knows for certain where we will go. This leads some people to think about the animals for which we have taken dominion and wonder, what do animals think about dying?
Welcome to the award-winning Food Chain Radio Show with your host, Michael Olson. And now get ready for 1 hour of What's Eating What Radio.
Well, hello out there. You are tuned into the 1367th edition of the Food Chain Radio Show. Hey, perhaps you're among our friends way down there in Fremantle who are tuned into the podcast as we stream along the Food Chain page at metrofarm.com. Well, whoever you are and wherever you are, welcome aboard. I am Michael Olson, your host for this hour of What's Eating What. Folks, up and down the food chain, it is eat and be eaten. This elemental fact gives rise among people to thanatology, which is the study of death. Today we begin our food chain discussion with some concluding thoughts about thanatology from Playing Possum, How Animals Understand Death by Susana Monso. Scientists have been trying for a long time to find a characteristic that will definitively separate us from other species. So far, all candidates have failed. Neither the use of tools, nor culture, nor morality, or rationality are exclusive to human beings. Nor is the concept of death. We're not a unique species. We're just another animal. And as such, we're bodies that work until a certain point, but end up irreparably broken. Perhaps if we come to terms with the fact that we're animals, we may also reconcile with our other own mortality. But before we come to terms with the fact that we are just another animal, we must find a way to step outside of our anthropocentric way of seeing life and death. And so we ask, what do animals think about dying? Well, who better to ask than Susana Monso, author of Playing Possum, How Animals Understand Death. Welcome to the food chain, Susana. So pleased to have you aboard. All the way
Thank you
from
so much
Madrid,
for inviting me.
All the way from Madrid. Welcome.
That's right. Thank you.
Well, I haven't been to Madrid. Closest I've got was Portugal, but Spain is always one of those places that I have reserved for places to go. And
well, it's really nice. I can recommend it.
All right. Good to go. So, why Playing Possum? Where did you come up with that? Playing Possum.
Do you mean the title or the book itself?
Well, let's start with just Playing Possum.
Well, this is actually a funny question because the book is translated from Spanish, and in Spanish, the original title is Schrodinger's Possum. So it's a pun it's a reference to Schrodinger's cat, because the possum, as you may well know, is in the habit of playing dead whenever she feels threatened, right? And she has this very spectacular performance of death, but she's actually alive while she's playing dead. So she's sort of like Schrodinger's cat in that she's dead and alive at the same time. So that's the title in Spanish, but Princeton University Press, with whom I'm publishing the English edition, which is coming out on the 15th of October, they thought that this might confuse some readers into thinking that this was a physics book, and they wanted to make it very clear that this is a book about animals. So we changed the title to Playing Possum, which is an expression that I love. It's very handy because it's an expression that means to play dead, and it makes reference to the opossum, who is a very important piece of the philosophical puzzle that I build in this book.
Wow. Okay. And a question I've always wanted to ask, and often do ask when the subject comes around to plants and animals and people, at what point, Susana Monso, along the continuum of life from the higher forms to the lower forms, at what point does sentience come into play?
That is a very difficult question to answer. I think there are different views, and I don't think anyone can really assert anything with any real level of confidence, because we still don't know how to measure sentience. We still don't really understand how it happens at a neurophysiological level. So all we can really do is speculate. I quite like the view defended by Kristen Andrews, who thinks that all animals are sentient. So even like what you would consider very basic animals are sentient. And I think, I do see the intuitive pull of this idea, because in the end, these are animals who, well, if they don't, these are beings who, if they don't learn at all, they're going to have difficulties going through life, right? And it seems that sentience is very important for learning about what is good for you and what is bad for you. But some people want to extend this idea even broader. So Paco Calvo, for instance, who is a philosopher from the University of Murcia in Spain, he thinks that plants are sentient too.
Me too.
Oh, well, maybe you should invite him on the show. So he thinks that if you are rooted to the ground, you actually have to be even smarter than an animal, because you can't run away. So I think that's a very interesting way of sort of like shifting the question around, right? Since they cannot run away, actually sentience might be important, because we have trouble maybe seeing plant sentience because it just manifests in the way that plants grow, and they do it so slowly. They're on like a different time frame completely. But they might also be growing away from whatever hurts them. And we do know that they have some defense mechanisms against things that can threaten their integrity. So it's an interesting hypothesis. I'm open to it.
That kind of is a good segue to my next point. Genesis 1:26, the Bible says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our own image, in our likeness, so that we may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. That people have long since taken dominion over many, if not most, of nature's creatures, has led us to see ourselves as the focal point of life on earth here. What led you, Susana Monso, to step outside this anthropocentric way of seeing things and look at things that the way animals might look at them?"
Well, I guess there's an answer from a personal level and more from an academic level. Like personally
Start with the personal
yeah.
level.
So personally speaking, definitely the genesis of everything was my dog. And actually he is the one to whom my book is dedicated. He passed away at the beginning of the pandemic, sadly, but he was so important. He really was the love of my life. And for me, he was the one who just opened up all these questions for me. I used to not be particularly interested in animals, which is weird because now they are my very reason for everything that I do. But I remember as a kid, I walked down the street and I wouldn't be one of those kids who would stop to say hello to any dog that I encountered or anything. I wasn't really interested in them, but my dog, he really just showed me that animals are people as well, that they have their own personalities. And my dog was a wire-haired dachshund, and these are very, very stubborn dog with very strong personalities. And so you couldn't convince him to do anything he didn't want to do. So it was so clear that he had preferences, and that he was his own unique individual. So that kind of really sparked my interest in the animal mind in general. And then more academically speaking, I studied philosophy in my bachelor's, and then I did a master's in applied ethics. And for my master thesis, I wrote about farmed animals. And I remember that I was reading a lot of animal ethics, and very often the claims about how we should treat animals are dependent on certain claims about the minds of animals or the distribution of cognitive capacities across the animal kingdom. But very often these claims are made without any reference to scientific studies, just in a sort of like a speculative fashion, where the author is just saying, well, I gather that this capacity, sentience, or whatever is going to be more or less present in, I would say, mammals and birds. But, I thought that this really weakened the arguments, And so that was, academically speaking, what made me want to pursue a PhD in animal minds. And that is where I work now. And for me, working in animal minds means constantly trying to fight your own anthropocentrism, which is, of course, a very difficult thing to do, but we're trying.
Well, that calls up all kinds of things. First of all, I have a dog too, and I look at that dog and she thinks. I know she thinks.
Yeah.
Is that a fair thing to say?
I mean, the thing is that, of course, there are reasons for skepticism, and there is an argument to be made as to why you might just be projecting your own thoughts and feelings onto her. That's a possibility, but it's also true that you spend a lot of time with her, and if there's anyone who can say whether or not she thinks, it's probably you. Like, I'm quite inclined to believe the judgments of people who spend a lot of time around animals. And I have this experience where I will talk to animal scientists. I really like to befriend them, and then talk to them in private outside of, the Q&A of a conference or whatever. And when you're talking to them in private, they will all say that, of course, their animals think and they have personalities, and and this one is so and so. This guy's an asshole, like he's always trying to ruin the experiments, and this one is so uncooperative, and this guy hates blondes, and you get all this like gossip, so to speak, that they would never write in a paper, because of course it's difficult to really argue for it scientifically. But deep down they know, because with a lot of animals, especially animals that are closely related to us, it's very difficult not to have these ideas come up in your mind when you're interacting with them.
Proximity. When you're close
Right.
to something, you spend time with it. And that's why I've come to the conclusion that I think plants have sentience too, because I've spent serious time with plants.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I wouldn't write about it in a scientific paper, but I would stay right here with you. I would say I think plants have sentience because I spent a lot of time with them, and I just sense that they have a thought or two about what's going on in their world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very interesting subject, which is thanatology with respect to animals. What do animals think about death? What do we think about death? Ooh, boy. So we're going to step outside our anthropocentric way of seeing things, and we could do that because we have Susana Monso with us today, and she is the author of Playing Possum, How Animals Understand Death. We will be right back, so please do stay tuned.
The votes are in. Chef Ben here from Back 9 Grill and Bar at the Easy Off Past Tempo exit. We are so proud of our food and our service and your votes. Back 9 has been voted Santa Cruz County's best burger and best happy hour in the good times. You've heard me talking about our house ground burgers. It's time for you to come and try one so you can taste the juicy difference. And what makes our happy hour the best? You have to come and experience it yourself. See you at the 9.
You need a clean, pleasant space to conduct business, but you don't want the burden of a long, expensive lease. Your solution is Satellite Co-working and Digital Media Studio on SoCal Avenue. Satellite offers private offices, meeting and conference rooms, even co-working by the hour, day, week, or month. Schedule a tour at satellitecoworking.com. Mention Santa Cruz Voice for 20% off your first reservation.
The Hook is California's first ever cannabis outlet. 100% locally owned and operated, we're here to be your friendly neighborhood hookup. We believe that everyone should have access to fairly priced cannabis, so we work hard to get it to you for 30 to 50% less than the other guys. If you're 21 or older with a valid ID, visit us in Capitola or in Watsonville today. We're here to be your friendly neighborhood hookup. Check out our website, hookoutlet.com, for deals and stay groovy.
You never get a second chance to make a good first impression. When you want to make a good first impression, start with Dynamic Press Angelo.
Dynamic Press can take care of every printing need, from business cards to stationery, apparel, mailings, brochures, everything but money.
When you want to make a good first impression, start with Dynamic Press in Santa Cruz.
479-7920. dynamicpress.com.
Attention content producers. You can have access to a complete digital production facility at Satellite Co-working and Digital Media Studio on Soquel Avenue near downtown Santa Cruz. Rent video and audio equipment, a studio with green screen, editing suite, and an audio booth, all at can't say no rates. Schedule a tour to see for yourself at satellitecoworking.com and mention Santa Cruz Voice for 20% off your first reservation.
When you need help managing your estate, call on the Angel.
Hello, I am attorney Angel Hess, and I am ready to help. Whether you need a will or a trust, a guardianship or a conservatorship, or if you are managing the financial affairs of a loved one, I will help you with over 7 years' experience working in estate planning and probate fields.
When you need help, call on the Angel, attorney Angel L. Hess at santacruzlegal.net. Hey, Warren, you know it's been a while since I've been up to your showroom and garden center in Scotts Valley. Maybe the folks out there might want to know where you are.
And now, back to What's Eating What on the food chain with Michael Olson.
You know, Susana Monso, as a person who considers what animals perceive and think about, there was one person who really struck me as being very good at that, and her name is Dr. Temple Grandin. I don't know if you ever heard of Dr. Temple Grandin or not.
Yeah.
But she is severely autistic, and yet her gift is being able to see things as animals see things. And because she has this ability, she's able to help farmers and ranchers develop facilities to better manage their livestock. How did you learn to step outside of your anthropocentric way of seeing life? You had a pet, and all of a sudden you're not looking at your pet as a pet, but you're looking at your pet as a living thing that has thoughts and feelings. How did you manage to make that leap?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, in the case of my dog, it was just impossible not to make that leap because, as I said, his personality was just too strong. He couldn't really handle it otherwise. But of course, that doesn't necessarily rid me of anthropocentrism. It just sort of made me open to the idea of animal minds and interested in animal minds, right? But that's still a long way from actually being able to approach this subject in a non-anthropocentric way. I wouldn't say that I completely managed that in my book or in my writings. I certainly try it, and I certainly have it as an ideal. And I think it's important to have it constantly as an ideal in your writing, and to be very critical about whatever it is you're saying about animals, and always trying to ask yourself whether or not you're being anthropocentric. And definitely one of the best ways to step away from anthropocentrism, or at least mitigate it, is simply by reading about animals, looking at animals, spending time with animals, spending time with people who know animals, and just getting to know them and getting to know other ways of being. There is, for instance, this fantastic book. It's one of my favorite books ever. It's called An Immense World by Ed Yong. And in this book, Ed Yong talks about animal senses, and he talks about what animals can perceive that we cannot perceive, and all this world that is opened up to them and that is completely non-existent for us from our perspective. And so if you read this book, it really makes you feel much more humble as a human being, understanding that you do not have access to the truth of reality. You just have access to a sliver of reality that is very constrained by what you can sense. And so that is already, I think, a very interesting way of stepping away from your anthropocentrism, understanding that there are other ways of being in the world, other ways of sensing the world and understanding it. And, it's this sort of stuff that can help you. And it's an ongoing process. I don't think you never really reach a point where you can say, I'm no longer anthropocentric. I don't think that ever happens, because you can't really escape your sapiens brain, right? But there's definitely a lot of value, I think, in having it as an ideal and trying to mitigate it as much as you can.
Got to fight for it, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, good. In the opening pages of Playing Possum, you feature a photograph titled The Silence of the Chimps. And that photograph just stopped me in my tracks. Because a couple of days later, I happened to be watching the news, and there was exactly the same photograph, only it was people. And they had the same expression. So would you tell us about The Silence of the Chimps?
Yeah, so The Silence of the Chimps is the title of the chapter, but the book, the photo is actually called The Grieving Chimps.
The Grieving Chimps.
Yeah. And it's a picture where you can see a dead female chimpanzee who's being carried away by two humans. And then behind the fence, you see a group of 16 chimpanzees, and they're all staring very intently at the corpse. It's very, very striking. And it's especially striking if you've ever had the chance to observe chimpanzees, because chimpanzees are very active individuals. They have very short attention spans. They are, constantly interacting with each other, exploring, playing, and it's just very striking how the 16 of them are doing exactly the same thing in such a, you can see their silence in the picture, right? And this is what the photographer said as well, that she was so struck by their silence because they're such loud creatures normally. So there was,
You could see them confronting death.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So this picture was published in National Geographic in 2009. And it's really sort of, I think it was really the trigger that set comparative thanatology in motion. So this is the study of animals' relationship with death. And we can think that it started with this picture because shortly after, so many biologists started publishing these cases that they had witnessed, that they hadn't really thought of turning them into a paper. They just happened to come across a case like this. But suddenly there seemed to be this interest in this topic. And so
this is
all these papers published.
This is new material. This is new territory for the human mind when it gets right down to it. Kind of sprung loose by this photograph.
Yeah. I mean, of course, historically speaking, there have been mentions of this sort of thing before in the past, but I would say that the systematic study of this phenomenon was really triggered by this picture, and especially by a paper that was published shortly after by James Anderson and colleagues that was sort of a manifesto in defense of the importance of studying comparative thanatology.
Good. And from there, you take us throughout the world on a tour of thanatology. And I guess you begin with your own story about the ant.
Yeah. Yeah. This it's an embarrassing story, but I can tell it.
Please do, especially if it's embarrassing.
Okay, so yeah, it's a story. It's one of these weird memories that stick in your mind with like high vividness. You know, sometimes it happens that you have these memories from when you were a very young child that just stay there. And this was a time where I had gotten a microscope as a present. And I was sort of really excited about the microscope. But then actually a microscope is actually pretty boring if you don't have anything interesting to look at. And I didn't really have any interesting stuff at home to look at. And so I wanted to find something interesting. And I came up with the idea of looking at an ant. And so I didn't want the ant to be stomped on because I wanted to have a look at the intact subject. So there were these little sample tubes that came with the microscope, and I just trapped an ant in it, and I put the sample tube in my pocket, and I spent all day with the sample tube there. It was kind of a bizarre thing to do, but I do remember running it past my dad and him saying, "Yeah, go ahead." So I don't know. I just did that, and many hours went by, or at least I remember it as many hours. I remember we went to an aunt's house and then we came back. And then at some point I took the tube out again, and the aunt was still alive. She still hadn't died. And suddenly, all of a sudden, and this is funny because it's a phenomenon that happens, that sometimes the person we are in the evening is so different from the person we are in the morning, right? I looked at the tube and I saw the ant in it. And all of a sudden I was really overcome by this moment of very intense empathy with the ant, and like this indignation at myself for what I was doing and how could I be so cruel. And so I just remember walking up to a rose bush that there was in our garden and releasing the ant. I really remember doing this. And I remember as well that it was completely an autonomous choice on my behalf. No one told me to do it. My dad was fine with this. I hadn't told anyone else about this. And this was a moment of me alone with the ant, just deciding to free her and really feeling like I had done something right in that moment.
And now you're pursuing a doctorate in animal ethics, right?
Well, I got my doctorate many years ago now.
Okay.
But yeah, I would end up pursuing a career in animal ethics. And this was, I think, maybe one of the important points in my life that would later come to determine who I was, right? Because I think it's not common for an 8-year-old kid to empathize with an ant, especially if no adult is telling her to do that. It came from me. I don't know why, but it happened. And I think that's an interesting thing, but it's also the reason I tell this story in my book is also because I think there are some interesting things already about the sort of concept of death that I had at that time. That was already quite sophisticated, despite me being quite young.
Yeah. Something perhaps that's already there.
I mean, it's something that is learned, but humans are very exposed to a lot of teaching about death from a very young age, right? I hadn't really had any real life experiences with death, but of course, like I had watched Bambi and The Lion King, and and I had conversations about what's going on, and I remember maybe it was around that time, or maybe it was earlier. I do remember at some point in my childhood being very terrified at the idea of my own death, and having like nightmares about it and everything. So, yeah, it's something that kids go through, right? This learning process, but it's a very different one from what you're going to find in nature, because animals who learn about death are going to learn in a very different way.
Well, with that, tell us about the whale who carried her baby halfway across the world.
Yeah, so this is a story that made the news in the summer of 2018. It's a very sad story about an orca who gave birth to a calf who died very shortly after birth. And this orca is part of a population of orcas that hadn't seen a live birth in several years, and they're an endangered population. And orca pregnancies are very long. I think they're 17 months. The exact length is in the book, but I think it's around 17 months. So it's a very long pregnancy. And orcas are also animals who have very strong mother-infant attachments. And so when the baby died, the mother orca, she just couldn't accept it, or at least that's what it seemed like, because she spent the next 17 days swimming while balancing the baby orca's corpse on her snout for over 1,000 miles and barely eating anything in the process. So this is a very remarkable behavior, especially because these animals, they don't have limbs. And a newborn calf weighs hundreds of kilos. And they have to regularly surface in order to breathe. So this is a very difficult behavior to carry out for 17 days in a row. So the motivation must have been very, very strong. And for many people, this was an example of grief. The mother was grieving for the death of her baby, and that's why she couldn't let go.
Is grieving thinking?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I am inclined to think, following what Barbara King, who has written a wonderful book on animal grief, following what she says there, I'm inclined to think that grief is more a matter of love than an intellectual achievement. So grief is what happens when you lose someone that you love very deeply, or that you have a very deep attachment to. So it's not so much about understanding the situation, but rather, it can happen, I think, even if you don't really understand the situation. It's about wanting someone, and that someone not being there, either because they're not responsive or because they're gone. And so it's born out of love rather than out of thinking.
Then that is an emotion without thought.
Well, I wouldn't say it's without thought, because grief is a very long process. In human beings, it definitely is intertwined with thinking, and it's not even a single emotion. It's more like an emotional process that extends over time. And of course, it interacts with our thoughts. It might interact with feelings of guilt or thoughts about what you could have done differently, or and some people also might need a certain cognitive process. Like, for instance, you hear this in a lot of people who have lost someone who just disappeared, how important it is for them to find the body, because they need closure. And this closure seems to be at least partly like a cognitive process where you have that information for sure. You have certainty. This is what happened. And that allows you to move on. Right? So I wouldn't say it's completely detached from thinking, but I think it's mostly born out of love. Okay.
And we're pursuing this notion here of animal thoughts about death with Susana Monso, who is the author of Playing Possum. And it's proving to be very interesting. When we come back, we have lots more stories. So don't go away, because you're not going to want to miss these. Right back.
When you buy local American-grown flowers, flowers will grow and flourish in America. Hello, I'm Deborah Prinzing, author of Slow Flowers for certified American-grown flowers. When you buy local flowers, you're helping our country's family farms reduce the transportation footprint of flowers and enjoy fresher, longer-lasting bouquets. So please, next time you shop for flowers, think local. Think certified American-grown flowers. Visit AmericanGrownFlowers.org to learn more.
History buffs. This tale from Michael Olson's Tales from a Tin Can took place aboard the USS Dale at Guam, 15 August 1945.
When word came through that the war had ended, everyone went wild. We made noise with whatever we could get our hands on. Sirens shrieked, bells rang, horns bellowed, sailors whooped and hollered. I was the wildest of all because when I first went in the Navy, I read you had to do everything you could to keep your head and nerves together so you could survive to the end. Well, I held myself together almost 4 years aboard that tin can, and I made it through to the end. Yes, I celebrated. I whooped and I hollered and I banged on metal. You bet I did. And I celebrated a bunch for all those guys that couldn't, too.
Tales from a Tin Can contains 424 tales by 44 sailors aboard the USS Dale, from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. Order your Father's Day copy at talesfromatincan.com. That's talesfromatincan.com. talesfromatincan.com.
Hi, folks. How many of you out there love to garden? Wouldn't it be nice to grow some of your own food? Or maybe a flower garden would brighten your day. Well, now you can have the pleasures of gardening without all that effort. You don't need a tractor. You don't need a rototiller. All you need is the Knox Garden Box, a heavily constructed, portable, elevated garden on legs that can virtually change the way you've gardened in the past. The Knox Garden Box can be set up anywhere. Yes, you can place it right on concrete. For those with bad backs, you've got critters and gophers, no space, or maybe no dirt. With the Knox Garden Box, the therapy of garden is now the prescription for good mental health. The way to find your fabulous Knox Garden Box is by logging on to knoxgardenbox.com. That's Knox, gardenbox.com. Or by calling 831-461-9430.
We're on the farm with Joel Salatin.
Would you like to buy homemade soup, backyard chicken, and the neighbor's artisanal lunch meat? The Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund protects your right to acquire the food of your choice from the source of your choice. I'm Joel Salatin from Polyface Farm, and I urge you to defend the right of neighbors to engage in direct food commerce. Join today at farmtoconsumer.org, the food of your choice from the source of your choice. That's farmtoconsumer.org. farmtoconsumer.org. Thank you.
So much to say, so little time to say it on the food chain with Michael Olson.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Food Chain Radio program. Today we're talking about death, and specifically what animals might be thinking about death, with Susana Monso, who is the author of Playing Possum, How Animals Understand Death. Wow, what a subject. Now we have our new intern here is going to ask a question. Charlotte?
Yeah, I was interested in your animal concepts idea. The fact that animals can think, but they don't necessarily grasp concepts. And there was like a lot of philosophy behind that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about animal concepts.
Yeah. So there's a big debate in philosophy of animal minds about whether there can be thoughts without concepts, because for a long time people thought that thoughts were made up of concepts. And so if you couldn't have concepts, then you couldn't have thoughts. But I think that most people nowadays would accept that there are forms of thinking that don't require concepts. So for instance, thinking with images or making mental maps. Like for instance, say, imagine you are walking through a maze and you find some food, and then you walk back and you want to find the food again. You might use some mental map that you've made that allows you to sort of retrace your steps and find the food again. We know that animals can do this. At least rats are very good at this. So these are ways of thinking that don't require concepts. So concepts are usually, there's a whole debate about what concepts are, but a way of understanding them is sort of as though they were units of thought. And they're units of thought that can be sort of detached and recombined in different ways. So for instance, you have the concept dog, and you have the concept blue, and you have the concept green, and you can think the dog is blue, but you can also think the dog is green. It's because you have these detachable concepts that you can recombine in different ways. Yeah. So when we're asking whether animals have a concept of death, what we're asking is basically whether they can do something different than just discriminating death. So, for instance, coming back to the ants, ants and other insects are pretty good at discriminating dead individuals. So, for instance, ants will do this thing where if they come across a dead ant inside the colony, they will pick her up and they will take her outside into the refuse pile. So this presupposes a capacity to tell live ants from dead ants, right? And so one might think, do they have a concept of death? Well, we know that it's not really mediated by concepts because it's a very rigid stimulus response mechanism. That what happens is that when ants die, they give off these smells, these pheromones that live ants can detect, and that sort of trigger this behavior of taking whatever smells like this out into the refuse pile. And we know that this is the case because if you take a little pebble or you take a little piece of leaf or even a live ant and you put a drop of one of these chemicals on them, the other ants will treat it like they would a dead ant. And they're not capable of making the inference from, oh, this ant is moving her limbs around to the conclusion she must not be dead. They're not really capable of that because they're just not operating with a concept of death. All they're doing is detecting an odor and and then beginning a pre-programmed, so to speak, behavioral process. So this is different from having a concept of death. Having a concept of death means being able to recognize death when it happens to different individuals in different contexts, in different contexts when it looks differently. So it's not rigidly dependent on a small set of stimuli, but rather you can recognize, say, coming back to dogs, perhaps you can recognize things as dogs that look very, very different. Think about the difference between a Rottweiler and a Chihuahua, right? They don't look alike at all. And yet you can still recognize them as dogs because your concept is not dependent on certain stimuli. You have more general knowledge about what it is to be a dog. Dogs have 4 legs, they bark, they have fur, they smell a certain way, they move around a certain way, and that allows you to recognize dogs. So when I'm asking whether animals have a concept of death, I'm interested in whether they can do that sort of cognitive work, and especially whether they can process what it means to be dead, which is something that the ants don't seem to be doing. They are just offering this pre-programmed response to a stimulus, but they don't really seem to offer any understanding of what it means to be dead.
What about then the elephant who collected ivory?
Yeah. So elephants are an animal that always comes up in discussions on death, right?
Why is that?
Yeah. So there's this myth that they have these elephant graveyards that, as far as I could tell from the research I've done, is just a myth. They're not actually real. But elephants do have a lot of interest in death, and specifically in the death of conspecifics. When an elephant died, the corpse is usually visited by not just her family members, but also members of other families. There's like a literal parade of animals, of elephants coming to the corpse and smelling it and touching it and just hanging around it. So they seem to be very interested in this phenomenon. And I think elephants are a very interesting case study because they exemplify in a very strong way what I think are the 3 main causal factors in the development of an animal's concept of death. Firstly, the first causal factor is cognition. So it's the idea that an animal who can develop a concept of death needs to have a certain level of cognition. And elephants, we all know, they're very intelligent animals. And they have specifically a kind of intelligence that's very attuned to the social realm because they are so social, right? And then we need to have very strong emotions involved, because emotions are what modulate your attention. In order to learn about death, if you're an animal in the wild, you need to pay attention to a corpse for a pretty long time to understand what happened, because no one's going to be there to explain it to you, right? Assuming that they don't have a language that's sophisticated enough for that. So you need to pay attention to it, and emotions are key for this process. And elephants, of course, have very strong social bonds, and this generates very strong emotions whenever an elephant dies. And lastly, you need experience with death. That's the last causal factor. So assume that no animal is born with the concept of death, but rather that you need experiences with it in order to learn about it. And elephants are very long-lived animals. They can live up to 70 years. But at the same time, in the wild in general, there's a lot of deaths. Animals in the wild have much more direct experience with death than we do. But also among elephants specifically, there's a high infant mortality rate, which is also very common in many animal species. And so because they have such strong social ties, if a little elephant dies, the others are really going to pay attention to it. And in fact, there was recently a super fascinating paper, super puzzling one, where they documented several calf burials on behalf of the elephants. The elephants had actually buried the calves, which is just fascinating. So it's still very early. We still don't quite know what it means or what was going on, but this is a behavior that happens. And we also that chapter is called The Elephant Who Collected Ivory, because we've also seen them grabbing ivory and taking it away with them, God knows where. You know, they seem to be very interested in everything that has to do with elephants and elephant corpses and elephant bones.
Does size have something to do with this too? Because you mentioned the whale who carried her baby and the elephant who collected ivory. So we're talking about great big critters that live.
Well, they're big-brained animals, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, of course, that's going to make a difference to the cognitive side of things. But these three causal factors that I mentioned earlier, cognition, emotion, and experience, they sort of, they're interrelated in a way where the high presence of one can compensate for the relative absence of another. So if you have an animal who had many experiences with death, but who weren't that intelligent, she might not need that much intelligence to learn about death if she's had enough experiences. And the other way around, if she's super smart, maybe just a couple of experiences already allows her to begin this learning process, right? So I don't think that this is a phenomenon that's going to be necessarily located in big-brained animals. In fact, in my book, what I argue is that the concept of death is so easy to acquire in the way I understand it, what I call the minimal concept of death. It's so easy to acquire, and it's related to capacities that are so important for survival that we're going to expect it to be actually pretty widespread in the animal kingdom. So not just in these usual suspects, so to speak. I mean, there's a problem here that there's also, of course, a bias towards studying these bigger animals because they're so iconic, and because also they are more closely related to us than other animals, right? Like birds or insects or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Parrots live a long time and get to be pretty smart. Mm-hmm. And I know a parrot who does not like males, but does like females. Mm-hmm. And I often wonder about his thought process. But at any rate, there's one animal I don't want to give short shrift to here, and that's the animal who brought flowers to the dead. Mm-hmm. And what animal would that be, Susan Monso?
Well, it's obviously the human animal, right? We also have, I mean, my book tries to argue that the concept of death is very widespread in nature, but also obviously our concept of death is quite unique in many respects because we have so many funerary rituals and so many symbols attached to this notion. And there's just so much that we do that has to do with death. And of course, we're not going to expect to find that in animals because these are things that are very dependent on our cumulative cultures. What I try to argue in the book is that the essence of a concept of death is nevertheless very widespread, and that these other notions, they don't necessarily engender a concept of death that is superior, or like, I don't know how to put it. I mean, the thing is that humans have a very pathological relationship with death, because even though we're the animal with probably the most sophisticated death-related cognition, we also are absolutely terrified of death, and we pretend that it's not going to happen to us for as long as we can, and we go through life, avoiding talking about death. It's really a taboo, especially in certain contexts. You just cannot talk about death, and it's considered bad taste to talk about death. And I think that's kind of, it's kind of worrying, because it's a reality that we're all going to face sooner or later. And I feel that we might be happier if we had a different relationship with death, a relationship where we accepted this reality more, right, as simply part of nature. So it's sort of like my hope would be to contribute to this, like a small grain of sand with my book. If I can manage to help people see that really we're just another animal when it comes to death as well. And, it's part of the deal. Like every single animal on this planet is going to have to face death, because that's the deal. We're alive, then we have to die, and you just can't get out of it. So we should find a way of reconciling with that fact.
It is what it is. I think of the videos and the real life experiences I've had of predators taking down prey. Mm-hmm. And the prey that got away kind of look over their shoulder and go, "I'm glad it's you, not me." And I guess that's kind of the way we go about coping with this stuff, with death.
Yeah.
And it just is what it is. So what do you talk about when you go out for a drink with somebody?
Yeah, I've learned that I have to be careful. I've learned the hard way that I have to be careful when talking about these things, because it happened to me once that I was at this dinner party and people were just asking me about my research on this, and I just kept, I talked for a while, and then I realized that everyone else at the table was looking really gloomy and really blue. Like I had just ruined their evening by talking about the inevitability of death and so on. Like after a while, when you've read about these things enough, you just stop attaching emotional significance to it.
There you go.
So, yeah.
Well, Susana Monso, author of Playing Possum, How Animals Understand Death. I, for one, am very grateful to have run across your book, and I'm very grateful that you took on this subject. So
thank you.
Thank you on behalf of all those people who need to pick up this book and read it.
You've been listening to the award-winning Food Chain Radio Show with Michael Olson. And if your friends missed the show, tell them to log on the Food Chain page at metrofarm.com for a listen. Now, go out and find some food with its farmer's face on it and live.